Hi everyone, I'm back. Oh, multiple requests, even though our whole world is falling apart. Gee, didn't Dr. Michaelvitz predict that? I thought she did. I gotta get comfortable in my chair here, downstairs next to my nice wood stove in the basement. And if you've never had wood heat, let me tell you, it's a necessity here in the northern part of the United States of America. And we have a lot of trees, and we consider trees to be a um, renewable forest, like a crop, you know. So, since I last read, we've learned that Dr. Michaelvitz has lost her husband. I believe that was in December, very close to Christmas, if not even on like Christmas Day or Christmas Eve Day or the day after Christmas. It was right around there, it was very close to Christmas. Her beautiful husband, David. And I recently saw a presentation. She also lost her daughter, and she's claiming both of those to have been due to medical, um, I don't know if you would call it malpractice or improper practice. I don't know if it was really like malicious malpractice, but I guess we shall see. There seems to be a lot of that going around lately. But chapter 5 of The Plague, the book The Plague by Kent Heckenlively and Judy Michaelvitz. The appearance of chronic fatigue syndrome and autism in the medical literature. From these experiments, it appears that all the ordinary laboratory animals, the mouse should be the best in attempting to produce poliomyelitis, for the virus survives in its brain for a longer time than in that of the guinea pig, rabbit, or rat. What about the ferrets and the cats? Dr. Maurice Brody of the New York Department of Health in 1935, reporting on experiments with his experimental polio vaccine. That's where that quote came from. Accordingly, the virus, in the form of an injected suspension of mouse brain, was introduced into several of these cultures of human tissue, which were then handled exactly as in the experiment with the mumps agent. That's Nobel Prize lecture, December 11th, 1954. Okay, here goes Judy. Attempting to identify the first outbreak or even the first patient with a new disease, often referred to as patient zero. I've heard them say that before. They were looking for patient zero when COVID 19 first started. Do you remember that? I remember that. They were looking for patient zero. Can be as frustrating as it is for a homicide investigator trying to solve a cold case, defying the staid image of science as a measured progression of small steps. The exercise may look like the antithesis of scientific method, involving wild leaps of speculation, departure from evidentiary reason, and even a radical reinterpretation of subjects they once thought to be well understood. Early AIDS investigation is a good example. New cases of the disease started cropping up in the early 1980s among gay men, and I remember that very well. These men were often dying of Kaposi sarcoma. I saw that in practice as a nurse. A cancer that had, up to that point, typically struck elderly Jewish or Italian men. In December of 1981, a gay man named Bobby Campbell posted Polaroid snapshots of the purplish Kaposi sarcoma lesions in his mouth and throat and on his torso in the window of Star Pharmacy in San Francisco's gay mecca, the Castro District. Oh, in his mouth? Ugh. He warned other gay men that something ominous was spreading around, and those who witnessed his stark admonition reported being chilled to the bone, sensing the community was tipping into a terrifying new era. A few years later, as the gay cancer spread through the district like wildfire, Star Pharmacy hung a plaque on their wall noting that they had reached a prescription sales record. The Jewish and Italian men who contracted this normally benign cancer would usually die with the unsightly but not fatal Kaposi sarcoma lesions, but be killed by other causes. These new atypical KS Kaposi sarcoma patients, on the other hand, also suffered from a staggering array of atypical ailments such as pneumocystis pneumocystis pneumonia that were generally not so virulent but were rapidly fatal in this population. The investigators tried to see if they could uncover any common links between the earliest cases of Kaposi's sarcoma in gay men. Eventually, they were able to find a patient zero, a charming, hypersexual French Canadian airline steward and athlete named Gaëtan Dugas, who frequented gay bathhouses in New York and San Francisco and had also traveled overseas. The little black book of Dugas held the names and numbers of many of the first cluster of AIDS cases in the United States, whom researchers were then able to link to other cases. Shortly after the publication of her October 2009 article in the Journal of Science, Mikovits attended a conference in January 2010 of Defeat Autism Now. DAN, Defeat Autism Now. Doctors. These DAN medical professionals held the opinion that a trifecta of genetics, infection, and toxins caused autism. Some of the Dan doctors focused on genetics, others on bacterial or viral infections, and others on ubiquitous toxins like mercury or lead. They shared the belief that autism spectrum diseases, ASD, always an acronym, resulted from some combination of these elements, creating a perfect storm. Mikovits had long been curious about a connection between ME, that's the myeloencephalopathy, and the CFS and autism, as her team had preliminary data for what appeared to be a higher than expected number of children with autism among ME or CFS patients and their families. Chronic fatigue syndrome is the CFS. On June 14, 1934, the train carrying Dr. John R. Paul, a small, wiry Yale Medical School professor with a fierce intellect, and Dr. Leslie Webster, a tall, good looking physician from the Rockefeller Institute with a Clark Gable mustache, was met at the Pasadena rail station by Dr. George Parrish, city health officer for Los Angeles. The men were immediately whisked to the mayor's office. High officials of the beleaguered, polio stricken city of Los Angeles welcomed them as saviors. In a letter written to his wife on the day after his arrival, Dr. Paul recounted the journey and the pandemonium that greeted their arrival. As we commenced to get Los Angeles papers, we realized we had newspaper troubles ahead. A telegram was received requesting that we disembark at Pasadena. There, we were met by the City Health Commissioner, Dr. Parrish, and his aides. We were told they had sidetracked us at Pasadena because of the size of the crowd at the terminal. Then they said the mayor was waiting to receive us and award us the freedom of the city. I said, positively, we will not give out statements. We came here to work. Leave us alone. And I believe this is back again on the polio, when they came for the polio. The scientists were treated like heroes before they had done a single lab test, and they must have felt like the stars of their own movie. After dinner, the police commissioner of Los Angeles gave us his private car, and we were driven at breakneck speed with red lights, policeman's radio, and siren going full blast. We skipped all traffic stops and just roared 18 miles to Hollywood's greatest premiere movie theater, where the great owner, Sam Grauman, gave us a complimentary seat. He held up the main show 3 minutes to meet us. My feelings cannot be committed to paper. Can you imagine? Actually, I think I'd like to do that at least once. Skip all traffic stops, sirens blaring. Woo! Right away. The Los Angeles Times gave a clear account of what the two men planned to accomplish on their journey to the West. It is the plan of the two physicians, with the assistance of Dr. James F. Trask of Yale Medical Institute, who will arrive Sunday, to undertake extensive laboratory tests and research in an effort to isolate the poliomyelitis virus and, through inoculation experiments with monkeys, seek prevention of the disease in the interests of humanity. They were men of science in the city of dreams. They didn't know it, but in addition to polio, they were about to witness the first recorded outbreak of myeloencephalopathy and chronic fatigue syndrome. Ah, there's the connection between polio. Paul and Webster were part of a second wave to arrive in Los Angeles from New York City. They were there to absorb a polio epidemic as it swept the city and, if possible, gain valuable information about it. One physician, however, was interested in protecting the doctors and nurses who were on the front lines of the terrifying epidemic. Dr. Maurice Brody, a young Canadian physician, excuse me, oh, I always seem to have to yawn. A young Canadian physician working at the New York City Health Department and at New York University had developed a polio vaccine. According to an account in the popular magazine, The Literary Digest, the funds for Brody's work came partly from the Warm Springs Foundation, in which President Roosevelt himself, a sufferer from infantile paralysis at the age of 40, is the moving spirit. I never knew that was the cause of his paralysis, infantile paralysis. Hmm. And was that a precursor to polio, or was that caused from hypoxia at birth? Who knows? The rest is being contributed by the Rockefeller Foundation and the New York Foundation, or even birth trauma, really. Brody had reputable support from the president's own charity in addition to the Rockefeller and New York Foundation. Talk about a trifecta. The researcher could not have had more powerful patrons than the president and the country's wealthiest charities. Brody later detailed the process of creating his polio vaccine, which consisted of up to 45 passages of the virus through mice. Isn't that interesting? There it is. Rockefeller and New York Foundation. Enter the Rockefellers. They always seem to be in the mix. Okay. Brody noted the passage material was a mixture of one part of active virus and four parts of a suspension of mouse brain and brain stem. The material from the 24th and 45th passages, injected into a series of mice in multiple inoculations, produced no effect in the mice, nor did the virus in either of these passages survive for a longer time than in the preliminary experiment, when it was demonstrated in the mouse brain 3 but not 5 days after intracerebral injection. Hmm. Trials of the Brody vaccine were subsequently conducted in North Carolina, Virginia, and California, and included 7,000 children, in addition to the 300 nurses and physicians from the Los Angeles County Hospital. In a later account of the 1934 Los Angeles epidemic, Paul seemed conflicted about the polio outbreak as well as the undefined new disease he witnessed. He wrote, to sum up various opinions about the Los Angeles epidemic, there seems to be little question that Los Angeles County was visited by an epidemic of poliomyelitis in the summer of 1934, although even this fact has been denied in some quarters. But a major question has been whether there was not some other unrecognized illness combined with poliomyelitis cases, as Dr. Webster had suspected almost at the start of our virological studies. And perhaps he was correct. In his account of the new disease, which affected 198 nurses and physicians, Paul relied on a later account by Dr. A. G. Gilliam, who observed that the majority of atypical symptoms could be described as rheumatoid or influenza in character. Hmm, that is kind of leaning viral, isn't it? Paul noted from the beginning that the vagueness of many of the symptoms caused some researchers to believe that they were dealing with an outbreak of mass hysteria. Oh, today we got mass psychosis. Paul noted that there were later outbreaks of this fatiguing condition he observed, namely in the winter of 1948 in Iceland and at the Royal Free Hospital in London in 1954, where the condition was first referred to as a myalgic encephalomyelitis. Myalgic encephalomyelitis. Why, that's a word to say. You should see how it's spelled. Now see how it's spelled. I don't know if you can see it, but yikes. Woo. Myalgic encephalomyelitis, which technically into muscle pain, myalgic, accompanied by inflammation of the brain and spinal cord, encephalomyelitis. The similarity of the second word to poliomyelitis should not be overlooked, as the new disease was quickly seen as polio like. In addressing the question of whether Paul and Dr. Webster failed to properly observe and classify a new disease rising alongside to the Los Angeles polio epidemic of 1934, Paul wrote, nonetheless, the Los Angeles episode is a reminder that even those who believe themselves to be experts occasionally ride for a fall. Although they may be extremely loath to admit it, especially to their patients, it is sometimes the bitterest pill they have to swallow. As a weak excuse, it may be said that we had our hearts so set on isolating the polio virus that we could think of little else. In their haste to isolate the polio virus, Paul and his team believe that they may have overlooked a new disease in their midst. What might an investigation by scientists into a virus, polio, is caused by an enterovirus? It would become a model for studying the biology of RNA viruses. Look like if it involved mice, monkeys, and men in the 1930s. While Brodie did not publish extensive notes of his experiments, future generations are fortunate to have a well documented example of the play by play of a similar investigation. This effort predates the use of the Brodie vaccine on the nurses and physicians at Los Angeles County Hospital. It was performed by scientists working at the Rockefeller Institute. There's that name again. Hmm. Scientists with whom Brodie would have had close association. It was an investigation into the harrowing disease, yellow fever, a viral fever that often induces a hemorrhagic response that causes patients to bleed to death. Oh, gee, aren't they just saying something about we should be worried about a hemorrhagic viral infection coming from China, where they have some cases of, what was it, Ebola and other hemorrhagic fevers. Hmm, maybe we should pay attention to this. Just my opinion. Remember, this is for entertainment purposes only. A viral fever that often induces a hemorrhagic response that causes patients to bleed to death. Gee, that sounds like Ebola to me. A 1932 article by the Rockefeller Institute stated exactly what they hoped to achieve with their research. The method here presented for vaccination against yellow fever was devised primarily to interrupt the long series of accidental infections of persons making laboratory investigations. Lab workers had become inadvertent soldiers in the pursuit of science and needed the body armor of an effective vaccine. You think? The scientists were dying from the disease they were studying. In the 4.5 years since researchers had started using rhesus monkeys as experimental animals to investigate yellow fever, there had been 32 infections among lab personnel and 5 scientists had died. That's an expensive loss. The concept of how to weaken a virus so that a human will produce an effective immune response to protect the host rather than injure or kill the host in cooperation with the virus is relatively simple. When viruses jump between species, their genetic structure undergoes changes that often make the virus more benign. So then they don't trigger that response. The alteration of just a few base pairs as the virus jumps can create an adjustment that causes a previously terrifying virus to become a pathogen the body can handle with relatively little difficulty, uh, so less infective. Modern day Ebola virus infection is a perfect example. Who said that first? For first human infections that are rapidly 100% lethal, but after several passages in humans, loses its lethality. That's why Dr. Judy says that we don't have to worry about Ebola because it's not as lethal as when it first came out. It's decreased, and they usually do as they replicate and they lose their virility. I'm I've heard that often said by virologists. However, the process can just as easily go in the opposite direction, turning a previously harmless virus into a killer. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. But remember, they had already proven that Ebola had weakened. Non endemic pathogens can also become virulently lethal in a new geographical location, which is why the pathogens carried by Europeans when they came to the Americas was so predictably devastating to the native populations. They didn't do it on purpose, guys. From early to mid 20th century, directing the evolution of the world's most dangerous viruses through various animal species and gentling them as a rancher would a wild horse was the holy grail of medicine. The question that would haunt researchers at the time and echo through research halls over decades was whether, in the attempt to conquer one disease, a researcher might inadvertently create another. This question became worth billions of dollars. Failing to adequately answer could have a devastating impact on the entire medical and scientific community. In other words, this is what the scientists of the Rockefeller Institute did 3 years before the Brody vaccine was used by 300 nurses and physicians at Los Angeles County Hospital. 3 years before. The preliminary experiments with various ways of vaccinating against yellow fever seemed to show the most dependable and effective of the methods tried was the injection of living yellow fever virus with the simultaneous or preceding infection of potent immune serum. Moreover, it appeared that yellow fever virus, after many passages through mice, had lost most but not all of its virulence for monkeys, and probably for man, although retaining its power to immunize. It was proposed, therefore, to test in monkeys the safety and the immunizing power of a vaccine composed of living virus fixed for mice and human immune serum, and if these tests gave satisfactory results, to commence immunizing persons exposed to yellow fever. While it may surprise people today, early experiments with vaccinations were often coupled with attempts to boost the immune system of an individual by use of an immune serum. Vaccines carried the risk of overwhelming a person's immune system, so steps were taken to increase the strength of the immune system as a precaution. What a novel idea! The Rockefeller researchers saw great promise in the work of their fellow colleague in the Institute, Max Tyler, winner of the Nobel Prize in 1951 for the development of a vaccine against yellow fever, who had succeeded in lowering the virulence of the yellow fever virus by passaging it through mouse brain tissue. That's just such Frankenstein science. I don't care. It doesn't make me comfortable. When Tyler showed that yellow fever virus, which had been adapted to mice, had lost much of its virulence for monkeys, the hope was raised that the untreated virus in mouse brain tissue, after enough passages in mice, would lose its virulence for man and would be safe to use as a vaccine. At the time of our experiments, the French strain of yellow fever virus had been through over 100 successive passages in mice and was nevertheless still able to produce fever in monkeys, although it had apparently long lost its power to kill them. The mice seemed to be the key to weakening the virus so that it would cause a fever in the rhesus monkeys when exposed to the virus, a sign that the immune system was attacking a pathogen, but not kill them. The generated fever showed the immune system had been provided enough help to fight off the virus and attain immunity to future exposures of the virus by encoding it as a threat. Human testing was the next step. 16 persons were vaccinated against yellow fever in this laboratory, the first on May 13, 1931, by the methods developed with monkeys. The first person to be vaccinated was admitted to the hospital of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research through the courtesy of Dr. Rufus Cole and Dr. T.M. Rivers and was closely observed for us by Dr. G.P. Berry of the hospital staff. There were no subjective symptoms and no abnormalities of temperature, pulse, blood pressure, heart action as shown by electrocardiogram, or urine during the 10 days in the hospital, 2 days before vaccination and 8 after. The other person vaccinated remained on duty in the laboratory. Researchers at the Rockefeller Institute seem to have established a sensible protocol for the yellow fever vaccine. It involved passaging the virus through mice tissue more than 100 times, then testing the vaccine on monkeys, and if that worked out without safety concerns, vaccinating humans. While this vaccine was used for some time among researchers in African countries, it was replaced by other vaccines that were not grown in mice. The reason: when the vaccine was injected into the brains of mice and monkeys, their brains quickly swelled with encephalitis and they rapidly died. This was not initially considered a safety concern since Jean Francis Aubrey, tonight Grandma is reading us a horror tale. It's just chapter 5. That's funny. So, they cause swelling in the mice's brains, and they didn't consider that a safety concern. Of course, this is 1931. Yellow fever. The problem with the yellow fever vaccine grown in mouse brains by the scientists of the Rockefeller Institute was the subject of a presentation Dr. G. Stewart to the World Health Organization in 1953. The neurotropic strain used in this vaccine is a derivative of the pantropic, and pantropic, that just means a lot more, French strain of yellow fever virus, which during prolonged serial brain-to-brain passage in mice, as shown by Tyler, to have lost its ability to produce visceral yellow fever in rhesus monkeys, animals, which when inoculated extraneurally with the modified virus ordinarily developed only a mild, non-fatal infection and consequent solid immunity. At the same time, however, the modified strain had acquired an enhanced neurotropic virulence for both mice and monkeys, producing in these animals, when injected intracerebrally inside the cerebrium of the brain, a rapidly developing fatal encephalitis. Didn't we have that concern earlier? Or maybe we should have. To put it in plain language, if the vaccine was injected into the bloodstream, it would provoke a mild immune reaction, after which the subject would be immune to yellow fever. But if the vaccine component somehow migrated into the brain, they would quickly produce a fatal swelling. The problems with this vaccine, grown in mouse brain tissue, were clear, and Stewart addressed them in his presentation. Two main objectives to this vaccine have been voiced because of the possibility that 1. The mouse brains employed in its preparations may be contaminated with a virus pathogenic for man, although latent in mice, or may be the cause of demyelinating encephalomyelitis. There's a nice word for you, huh? The use as antigen of a virus with enhanced neurotropic properties may be followed by serious reactions involving the central nervous system. It was all there in stark black and white. Plus, there was that word, encephalomyelitis. There were serious problems with using a vaccine developed by the passage of a human virus through animal tissues. The vaccine might pick up a virus from the mouse that was deadly to humans. This newly acquired virus could then cause the myelin sheaths, that was where they said the demyelating encephalomyelitis. That's what she's talking about here. Now I got to find my place. Okay. The newly acquired virus could then cause the myelin sheaths, which coat neurons like a protective plastic on an electric cord, to fall apart and turn the nerve endings to brittle threads. And the virus might make the body overreact, provoking autoimmune disease in which the body attacks not an invader, but rather it turns on itself. Mikovits would make the same arguments nearly 70 years later. Mikovits would also add the possibility that a recombination event might morph the human and mouse viruses into another entity altogether. Oh, goody, more fun. Brody's once promising polio vaccine never made it into general usage. A 20-year-old man vaccinated with Brody's polio vaccine developed paralysis in his inoculated arm and died 4 days later. That's alarming. According to a vaccine expert, Dr. Paul Offit, in his account of the Brody vaccine trials, two children, 5 and 15 months old, developed polio within 2 weeks of receiving inoculations. The Brody vaccine may have also induced the death of 2-year-old Jackie Baldwin of Healdsburg, California, in Sonoma County, north of San Francisco, in July of 1934, who died after receiving a polio vaccine administered by his father, a local physician. There's a reason why mom and dad should not treat their own children. Oh, Dad, I hope you could find peace after that. A local physician. This death in California is especially interesting as it took place around the midpoint of the first known myeloencephalopathy, like you know what I mean, ME, and chronic fatigue syndrome outbreak among the doctors and nurses at Los Angeles County Hospital. Remember when they got this job? By December of 1935, many members of the medical community, such as Dr. James Leake of the U.S. Public Health Service, were recommending discontinuance of the Brody vaccine. Despite what had been reported in the Literary Digest that the Warm Springs Foundation of President Roosevelt had contributed funding for the development of the Brody vaccine, in late 1935, the foundation distanced itself from the vaccine. And claimed only that they contributed money towards the building of a laboratory for Brody. According to Offit, after 1935, Brody found it difficult to get a new job, eventually accepting a minor demoted position at Providence Hospital in Detroit. Demoted. In May of 1939, Maurice Brody died at the age of 36 of a suspected suicide. Now that's sad. Suicide is always sad. While Brody's work with an ill-fated polio vaccine may have prompted his untimely death in 1939, his use of mouse brain suspension to cultivate the polio virus would result in three other researchers winning the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1954. The first outbreak of what would later be rebranded chronic fatigue syndrome started at Los Angeles County General Hospital in the late spring of 1934. At the time, General Hospital was a giant, the largest hospital in the world. Did they make a soap opera named after that? This myeloencephalopathitis, whatever, ME, chronic fatigue syndrome outbreak followed a polio outbreak on the West Coast in which 2,449 suspected cases were seen at Los Angeles County General Hospital. Now, since I can't say myeloencephalopathitis without having the word written, I'm just going to refer to it as ME because I don't want to go back and look and find the written version so I can pronounce it. Oh, it was considered an unusually mild form polio epidemic because so few deaths were reported. 198 doctors and nurses and hospital staff were eventually afflicted with ME or chronic fatigue syndrome from May through December 15th of 1934. Other accounts report even higher number. The disease outbreak was first thought to be polio contracted from patients, but it was something different, something distinct. Dr. A.J. Gilliam, an assistant surgeon for the U.S. Public Health Service, was dispatched to Los Angeles to investigate the larger cluster outbreak. Prior to this mission, Gilliam just happened to be investigating the efficacy of the Brody vaccine in North Carolina. Gilliam's boss was Leake, who eventually spoke out so strongly against the Brody vaccine. Gilliam later had a distinguished career as a professor of epidemiology at Johns Hopkins University. He wrote of the Los Angeles epidemic. These cases represent an attack rate of approximately 4.4% for all employees of the General Hospital. The rate in the medical units being 4.5% and in the osteopathic unit 1%. The personnel most severely affected were nurses and physicians who suffered attack rates of 10.7% and 5.4% respectively. Gilliam struggled to describe the constellation of symptoms and particularly the pain of the sufferers. The character of pain experienced varied within wide limits. It was frequently described as rheumatoid or influenza in character, an ache in the muscles or bones, but often of sufficient intensity to awaken the patients from sleep. Today, we would say that that is a pain level higher than the level of 6. So remember that. Anytime pain is waking you up or keeping you from going back to sleep, it is a pain level of greater than 5 or 6. In most instances, it was aggravated by exercise. It was confined to no definite body area and characteristically was variable from the day to day in its distribution. Headaches experienced by the patients were described as being of a character and severity never previously experienced by the patients. Well, if they're having swelling, the patients also suffered from muscle twitching, nausea, and vomiting. Other complaints included irritability, drowsiness, stiffness in the neck or back, photophobia, constipation, and tremors. The distribution of standard neurological symptoms, twitching, irritability, photophobia, along with flu like symptoms, nausea, and vomiting, certainly matched reports by Peterson and Cheney in Incline Village decades later, along with encephalitis and meningitis like symptoms such as stiff neck, crushing headache, even drowsiness. Oh, yeah, those are definitely encephalitis, meningitis like symptoms, which is a dangerous sign in known encephalitis causing pathogens as it can signal an approaching coma. Perhaps the most telling correlative to the more recent Incline Village outbreak of ME, chronic fatigue, chronic fatigue syndrome, however, was the description of the condition being aggravated by exercise. Oh God, I'm now having visions of the soccer players after that jab. When they're exercising, when do they collapse? This odd characteristic is so descriptive of ME or chronic fatigue syndrome that it has a name, post exertional malaise or PEM. Now, these were just, yeah, they weren't having heart symptoms on the soccer fields. They are collapsing and having heart symptoms. But the patients at the LA hospital did not recover, instead, falling into a pattern of lingering muscle weakness and fatigue that proved disabling. A majority of the cluster group who tried to return to duty subsequently found themselves unable to continue work and, in consequence, were sent off duty again. A portrait of modern day ME, chronic fatigue syndrome survivors. As the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's ME, chronic fatigue syndrome site states the majority of people with ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, are affected by post exertional malaise, which is defined as intensifying of symptoms following physical or mental exertion, with symptoms typically worsening 12 to 48 hours after activity and lasting for days or even weeks. The site conclusively adds while vigorous aerobic exercise is beneficial for many chronic illnesses, CFS patients can't tolerate traditional exercise routines. At the time Gilliam compiled his findings, he reported that 55% of the patients were still unable to re enter the labor force. That's significant. In summarizing his report, Gilliam observed that the disease appeared to show a preference for females. Oh, yes. Rather than males. I was wondering when we were going to get to that because that was already mentioned earlier, and females under 30 years of age rather than those over 30 years. Again, this parallels the more recent ME, chronic fatigue syndrome outbreaks. He also straddled the idea that this outbreak could be a new variation of polio or a unique entity. Weren't they trying to warn about that? The observed distribution of the disease is therefore what might have been expected had it been an epidemic of a disease such as scarlet fever, spread by direct personal contact with cases and carriers. It is quite different from what one would have expected in an epidemic such as typhoid fever, spread by contamination of the hospital water, milk, or food supply. In his report, Gilliam struggles with the question of whether the disease is the polio which is affecting the public or something completely different. Eventually, he comes down on the side of believing something new has entered the world. Irrespective of the actual mechanism of spread and of the identity of the disease, the outbreak has no parallel in the history of poliomyelitis or other central nervous system infections. There is nothing in past experience with this class of diseases which would have permitted anticipation of this institutional epidemic. It is curious that Gilliam refers to this as an institutional epidemic because it appears to have affected solely the employees of the hospital. If it was something in the food, the water, or any of the other myriad items in general use in the hospital, it would have affected both staff and patients, but it didn't. It only affected the staff. And wasn't it only the staff that was used the Brody vaccine? The critical question for any research is to what was the staff exposed that was uniquely different from that of their patients? Oh, I jumped ahead. I was too quick, sorry. In Hostler's Web, Hilary Johnson recounted the story sold to her by Canadian physician and research Dr. And we're back to, I think, Judy talking. Dr. Byron Hyde, who had studied Gilliam's report and in 1988 was subsequently able to locate and interview some of the doctors who had fallen ill during the Los Angeles outbreak of 1934 to 1935. According to Johnson, Hyde had it that there had been no medical follow up of any of the cases, which he suspected was the result of a legal settlement between the epidemic victims and the hospital. A condition of the settlement was that the victims refrained from discussing their ordeal publicly. How convenient for not the population, but possibly transparency. We need transparency. The 198 staff members sued the hospital, Hyde told Johnson, and eventually settled for $6 million in 1939, which would have purchased 3 houses for each victim in the best section of Los Angeles. Contingent on receiving the payment was non publicity of the epidemic. Selling out for money. The value of $6 million in 1939 would be just over $100 million in 2014. Oh my heavens. Johnson was unable to determine whether this amount had been paid in full by the Los Angeles County General Hospital or whether other groups contributed to the settlement. Either way, it was a good chunk of money so that we can remain cloaked. What set of facts might have caused an organization to settle for such an amount? They wanted to be cloaked. And what other incentives might there be for the victims of this disease to remain silent? In 1992, Hyde would publish a 724-page textbook, The Clinical and Scientific Basis of Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, under the Nightingale Research Foundation that he founded to better study the disease. He was assisted in this effort by Dr. Jay Goldstein of the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Institute of Anaheim, California, as well as Dr. Paul Levine of the National Institutes of Health. While Hyde generally applauded the job Gilliam had done in characterizing the epidemic, he believed there were conspicuous omissions from Gilliam's report, such as any sustained attempt to identify the cause of the outbreak, which would be common practice in this type of investigation. Not only did Gilliam give the first clear description of the acute and subacute characteristics of NE, or chronic fatigue syndrome, and its epidemiological factors, but his book also implicitly posed a question that has been avoided and unanswered to this day. A. Did the 198 healthcare workers fall ill or remain ill solely as a result of the prophylactic serum that Gilliam persistently documents as having been given, often prior to any symptom, to the majority of patients in this epidemic? Could the Brody vaccine have been the something different? I know I said that last page. Between the patient and the staff at the hospital from his discussion with the surviving doctors of the 1934-1935 epidemic, Hyde believes it is the most likely possibility. Hyde recounts what the doctors told him. Gilliam told Dr. Shelikov that he had been stymied by his superiors from telling the whole story. If the question concerning the pooled adult serum and convalescent prophylactic serum as a potential cause of some of the pathology is not clearly stated in the text of his book, there is ample reason for this. We know of the battle that Gilliam fought to even have the epidemic findings published. It was obvious that he was not going to rock any more boats if he is going to see document in print. Cloak. Hyde was interviewed in 2013 by the authors and had the following to say about Gilliam's work. In the original document, he, Gilliam, said it was caused by this immunization and it was a human transfer of infectious material. So it's actually a great experiment. He had a huge fight with the head of the public health system of the United States, and the fight went on for almost 6 months. Oh, just 6 months? My God. Nowadays, we keep them on for years. Finally, it was agreed that he would be allowed to publish it as long as they took out the immunization section, because if he put the immunization in, It would set back all Americans on immunizations for years and cause the death of many, many people. I think it was the theory then and still is today. As a physician, you cannot say anything negative about immunizations, even if it's causing problems. And they do. Oh, tell me about it. When I was first diagnosed in 1986 as being allergic to immunizations, and then I started looking into immunizations, I was called tin hat, conspiracy theorist, because I actually looked at the studies. I'm still a proud tin hat looking at the studies. In October of 1938, Dr. Leo Kanner of Johns Hopkins University met Donald Triplett, a 5-year-old boy who would be known for decades only as Donald T. Oh, can't do that today. People think you're talking about Trump. The first child in Kanner's 1943 article. Oh gosh, we're going to have to say the 5-year-old boy instead of Donald T. Describing a new condition known as autism. I know people with children who have autism or are on autism spectrum, and it's challenging. The Rockefeller Foundation supported Kanner's work. The Triplet family lived in the small lumber town of Forest, Mississippi, where yellow fever outbreaks had occurred. According to his father, Donald, the little boy, had always been fussy with food and was never interested in candy or ice cream. Smart child. I wish I could get that affliction, but I do love ice cream. At just 1 year old, he could hum and sing many tunes, and by the age of 2, had developed an exceptional memory for names and faces. As he grew older, maybe that's why I can't always remember names with the faces. I always remember the faces, not always the names. As he grew older, there was something peculiar about him, an abnormal insularity and aloneness. Donald's father was a successful, meticulous, and hard-working lawyer who, when ill, always followed doctor's orders punctiliously, even for the slightest cold. The boy's doting mother was calm, capable, and a college graduate. In their book on the autism epidemic, The Age of Autism, 2010, authors Dan Olmsted and Mark Blaxill uncovered many interesting facts about the families of the first 11 children diagnosed with autism. Autism patient number 2 was Frederick Creighton Wellman III. He was referred on May 27, 1942, at the age of 6 years. His father, Dr. Frederick L. Wellman, was a plant pathologist who worked in tropical areas of the world where yellow fever was common. The father of patient number 3 was a forestry professor who worked at the University of North Carolina. North Carolina was one of the states where the Brody polio vaccine underwent early trials and where Gilliam conducted his study on the vaccine. Again, there is the shadowy presence of vaccines, which had been passaged through mice. The father of patient number 4 was a mining engineer. The fathers of patients 5 through 7 were all psychiatrists, and the mothers of patients 5 and 7 were respectively a nurse and a pediatrician. The mother of patient number 7, Dr. Elizabeth Peabody, co creator of the Well Baby Visit, an early wellness concept that caught on through subsequent decades of post war hygienic concern. I got one of those when my babies were born in the 1970s by the county nurse, which we knew in our area, we knew her, which generally consisted of an examination of the child and an increasing number of immunizations designed to curb the infectious diseases of childhood. In the 70s, though, you still got you got your immunizations by this time now in the doctor's office and not by the county nurse. Although I imagine if you were very poor, it could be arranged to be given by the county nurse. It stands to reason that Dr. Peabody might have been among the first people that a researcher like Brody would have contacted to assist in his vaccination campaign. In an article about a talk Peabody gave in April of 1947, the Annapolis Capital reported, "Too many parents," said Dr. Peabody, have the proper shots given, and then relax, forgetting that booster shots are needed and that immunization does wear off. Speaking specifically of some of the most prevalent ailments, she stated that a child cannot be vaccinated against smallpox too often, and it should be done for the first time when a baby is between 3 months and 1 year of age. Kidding me? Where did, these monsters were around back then, too. The father of patient number 8 was a patent examiner, and his wife was a psychologist. Both of patient number 10's parents were in the medical field. His father was a psychiatrist, and his mother worked in a pathology lab. Would the offspring of these parents have been among the 7,000 children who received the Brody vaccine, which was claimed to offer protection against the scourge of polio? Of the 20 known occupations of the parents of Canner's first 11 cases, 10 were in scientific or medical pursuits. 4 were psychiatrists, 2 were plant scientists, and 1 was a psychologist, a nurse, a pediatrician, and the last worked in the pathology lab. 3 mothers were teachers, and the remaining professions broke down into lawyer, mining engineer, patent examiner, clothing merchant, advertising copywriter, magazine employee, and theatrical booking agent. Sounds like people who could afford to make sure their children got vaccinations. In their book on autism, Olmsted and Blackstill found the evidence pointed to 3 distinct clusters among the first 11 autism cases. The first was the mercury fungicide cluster, centered at the University of Wisconsin, and Frederick Wellman's work. Wellman's son was case number 2 in Canner's study. I am very allergic to mercury anything. In addition to Wellman, this cluster connected with case number 3, the son of William Miller, who was a forestry professor at North Carolina State University. The school had recently acquired an 8,000-acre tract of land known as Hoffman Forestry, or Forest. Ethyl mercury fungicides, including sarasan and lignansan, developed by Wellman and others, were being used at North Carolina's research station in the Hoffman Forest. Of the 2 compounds, lignasan showed the most promise. Beside the students and faculty using the research station in the Hoffman Forest, 3 lumber companies also shared the research station. Bad idea. Bad idea. One of the 3 companies, Eastman Gardiner, owned land that extended north to that of the territory of Bineville Lumber, headquartered in Forest, Mississippi. This was the home of Donald Triplett, patient number 1 of Canner's 11. Could the mercury from these agricultural products or the mercury derivative, thimerosal, that's the one I'm allergic to, used in Brody's vaccine, which was passage through mice, set off a chain reaction in susceptible children? While there was no direct evidence, Olmsted and Blackstill argued that it seemed logical to conclude that the smaller mills located in Forest also used lignasan in the years before the birth of Donald Triplett. Thus, the first 3 cases in Canner's group all had links to agriculture and forestry, and specifically to the Caribbean and southern parts of the United States, as well as to the use of mercury-containing fungicides. A question can reasonably be extrapolated from this knowledge. Might researchers traveling to undeveloped areas of the southern United States or to the Caribbean fear tropical diseases like yellow fever? Yeah, I think so. And have been among the first to volunteer for the Rockefeller Foundation's yellow fever vaccine without researching and investigating them? Oh, sure they would, except for this girl. But maybe I might have been, sure, had I not been diagnosed as allergic in 1986 and had a reaction and then became curious about vaccines, which is why I investigate them, research them, especially new ones. That should just be a good rule of thumb for everyone. Research. The 1933 annual report for the Rockefeller Foundation, just 7 months after the first successful human trial, does report just such an approach. Vaccination against yellow fever by the injection of human immune serum and living yellow fever virus fixed for mice was begun in 1931. Now, Jean-Francois Aubry, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I don't know, is it Jean or Jean? My cousin finished high school in his bed after getting his polio shot in the fall. Personally, I refused the vaccine at the age of 16. I am now 48. Oh, that's so sad. He had to finish high school in his bed. Yeah, I've heard of that. Jean Francois. Jeff? Was that your cousin's name, or am I supposed to be calling you Jeff? Come on, waiting. We're talking. I think it might be his cousin's name was Jeff. But how sad. Yeah. We had children that were had polio, or we were told they had polio. Oh, okay. Jean Francis Aubry says, me, call me Jeff. Okay, we're going to call him Jeff from here on. We had children in our schools, that um, JF or Jeff. Oh, I see it. My favorite brother, he got rectal anal cancer. He died in 2018. He was diagnosed in 2016. My husband was diagnosed with the same in 2017. My husband is still alive. My brother Jeff is gone, but I feel him around me, or his guardian angel. It's okay. Um, but I'll call you Jeff from now on. So back to this report. Vaccination against yellow fever by the injection of human immune serum and living yellow fever virus fixed for mice was begun in 1931. The number of persons vaccinated in the laboratories of the Rockefeller Foundation has now reached 56. These persons have been principally members of the staff of the foundation assigned to yellow fever work, and government officials, missionaries, scientists, and educators were about to leave for countries in which yellow fever was present. The second cluster was referred to as a medical cluster, embracing the fields of pediatrics, psychiatry, psychology, nursing, and pathology. This group contained cases 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10. Olmsted and Blaxill focused on the work of Peabody and the effort in the 1930s to vaccinate children with a new diphtheria toxoid shot containing thimerosal, a mercury derivative. We're very well aware of that. They asserted the likelihood that any parent involved in medicine would have been an early adopter of vaccines to protect their children. Would they also have been among the parents volunteering their children for an early Brody polio vaccine? Oh, I think so. Could they have been among the 7,000 children who received that vaccine? Very possible. Oh, we have a new person. Moon Norris. Voom today. I think we're supposed to call Moon Voom. So now we have Jeff and Moon, Voom, watching while we're reading. Blaxill and Olmsted argued that the clustering of some of the early cases of autism around Baltimore raised questions about whether the Johns Hopkins anti-diphtheria campaign of the early 1930s may have contributed to these first cases as well. Could the new diphtheria vaccines have also been the product of mouse-derived biological products, or might these children have also received a Brody polio vaccine? Could autism have spread among the members of the medical and scientific community as it did in the Los Angeles County General Hospital outbreak of ME, chronic fatigue syndrome? If so, might it have interrupted development only among those families whose parents had some acquired pathogen, perhaps transmitted to their offspring, who were also exposed to the mercury containing products and whose children were at a critical stage of development? Oh boy. Um, Jeff says that's the bot. KGB watching us. Hi, guys. Yeah, we're just reading a book. Ah, I'm not worried about anybody watching. I call my person who watches my stuff on my phone George. Hi George. Okay. If one considers the infection rate of 10.7% among the Los Angeles nurses in the ME chronic fatigue syndrome outbreak, presumably female, and 5.4% among the doctors, overwhelmingly male, then it's easy to see how even widespread exposure among medical professions would not necessarily translate into a perceived outbreak of autism among their children, as the secondary outbreak would have looked like a small trickle by comparison. The third cluster, containing only patients 9 and 11, seemed to only overlap in that they resided in major cities, specifically Boston and New York. These would have been natural places to conduct trials of either the Brody polio vaccine or other early vaccines, which at least partially derived from mouse products, and what of the thimerosal, the mercury derivative used in Brody's vaccine. I might also point out that since the Rockefeller Institute was largely located, I believe, in New York, and that's where his money would have been spent on clinics and such, that's also why you would probably see this in Boston and New York. That's just me speaking common sense, my opinion, no one else's, entertainment purposes only. So, the trifecta of genes, infections, and toxins suggested by the Dan doctors did seem to parallel much of the historical information uncovered about the earliest outbreaks of both ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and autism, while Blackstill and Olmsted were looking for evidence of thimerosal exposure in agricultural products. There was another potential source. Brody's experimental polio vaccine was given in combination with an immune serum specifically designed to increase the function of the immune system. This accompanying immune serum was preserved with merthiolate, a trade name for thimerosal. Merthiolate, oh my gosh, my mother used merthiolate on us all the time. No wonder I developed an allergy. In looking at the birth dates of the initial 11 autism cases from Kanner's report, rather than when they were seen at Johns Hopkins, it is clear that the first known child to have autism was born on September 13th, 1931. Wow, I didn't know that. Human testing of the first mouse monkey human yellow fever vaccine took place exactly 4 months earlier, starting on May 13th, 1931. The second child, Elaine C., was born on February 3rd, 1932, in Boston. The third child, Alfred L., had the birthday June 20th, 1932, the last child in Canada's first 11 children. Herbert B. came into the world on November 18th, 1937. In a little more than 6 years, 11 children came down with this previously unrecorded mystery affliction and found their way to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, where they were seen by Dr. Leo Kanner, a Rockefeller Foundation fellow. I'm sorry, I have good instincts. The parents of two of these children even knew each other. A country away in 1934 through 1935, 198 nurses and doctors at Los Angeles County General Hospital had fallen ill with the mystery affliction that made them even sicker the more they struggled against it, like Charlie Chaplin caught in a giant industrial cogwheel. The tight chronological association between these outbreaks is unmistakable. I feel a urge to let folks who are of a very younger generation know that Charlie Chaplin was from the silent films and very early 1900s entertainer, comedian actually. There were him and his brother. The tight chronological association between these outbreaks is unmistakable, as is the occupational connectedness of the victims' families, who were mostly well educated people in the medical or scientific professions. What else might these two diseases share? After nearly 8 decades, it may be difficult, if not impossible, to nail down an answer. But someone may have known further information. If Hyde's claims are accurate, oh gee, wouldn't some transparency been wouldn't that been nice way back here in the 1930s? No, we had to cloak. If Hyde's claims are accurate, a settlement of $6 million was distributed to the nearly 200 staff members of the Los Angeles County General Hospital in 1939, in the last official year of the Great Depression, when people were still sewing dresses from flour sacks. It seems beyond belief. Hey, flour sacks are perfectly good fabric. It seems beyond belief that the hospital would pay out an amount that would equal just over $100 million today, simply out of good conscience. It's plausible the payout was meant to compensate the staff for their injuries without assigning blame. Think. But then, if there was no actual or perceived blame, why were the afflicted not supposed to discuss the epidemic? Oh, that's taboo. Nobody can discuss things. You might get more knowledge that way. Quick questioning things leads to answers. Wouldn't that have been the standard scientific investigation for such an event? Perhaps it's a further stretch, but could the mystery entity have any link to the parents of the first autism cases? Given what we know today about the ability of viruses to recombine, is it possible that experiments at the Rockefeller Institute in the 1930s to create a yellow fever vaccine, and in later attempts by Brody and others to create a polio vaccine, might have accidentally created a mouse human hybrid virus that caused its own unique set of symptoms? Would scientists today even be allowed to conduct such an experiments, or were they a sign of more lax attitudes towards protecting human subjects? In the 2000 Pulitzer Prize winning book Polio, An American Story, author David M. Oshinsky recounts the 1930s race to develop a polio vaccine by Brody, his mentor William Parker, professor of bacteriology at New York University Medical School, and their rival John Columber, who was a Philadelphia pathologist, supported by a group of Philadelphia hospitals and medical schools. Wyshynski also addressed the fallout from this race. So that makes sense. I mean, that they were racing for the vaccine and they were studying both bacteria and virus, because I don't think they really knew what it was causing it initially. After first testing the vaccine successfully on monkeys, Park and Brody next tested the vaccine on themselves. There were no problems beyond some muscle discomfort near the injection site. Then a dozen children were vaccinated, all supposedly volunteered by their parents, and probably were. Inoculation of this material into several human volunteers having shown that it was probably safe for human administration, it was used in children. At that time, they had no idea that you really needed to study for like 10 years before you could really claim whether this vaccine is safe or not. I mean, that's how long it takes in modern day times, except for one particular jabadour. Park and Brody next tested the vaccine on themselves. Oh, I did that. Okay. Probably safe, used in children. These words, so chilling today, were hailed as progress by a public just awakening to the threat of polio. The effort fell apart when several scientists, including those from the Rockefeller Institute, who had pioneered the passaging of human tissue through mouse brains, and those in public health, like Gilliam's boss, James Leake, stated that not only was the vaccine ineffective, but questioned whether the vaccine may have conversely triggered the disease in some patients and caused injury or death in others. There we go. Okay, now Jeff says, the truth burned the evil flesh. Money cannot be the only answer. The real reason is darker. It comes a time when poisoning the well seemed funny for some. Isn't that sad, Jeff? Isn't that sad? Funny and folly. Just getting rid of the chaff. Describing human beings as chaff. Yes, I understand, Jeff. I understand. Okay, so in their discovery of XMRV, boy, we haven't heard that word for a couple of chapters. Silverman and DeVries found that the retrovirus was closely related to a known mouse retrovirus, but mice and men have shared the planet for millions of years. So, how did the retrovirus suddenly jump to humans? Could it be running a virus through a mouse a couple hundred times and then giving that vaccine with that virus in it to humans? If we believe Gilliam's opinion that ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, had a pathogenesis around 1934, we might have an explanation. We know that the Brody polio vaccine passage through mouse tissue was administered to nurses and physicians at Los Angeles County Hospital in 1934. Might this explain why only the medical staff of the hospital and not the more vulnerable patients came down with this new disease? Hmm. Just as the scientific community would come to believe that XMRV was derived from prostate tissue passed through mice, the question is whether something similar had happened decades earlier. Yeah, I see a correlation. Might have been nice to have some of that there transparency instead of that cloak. What is most curious about the 1934 investigation of the polio outbreak in Los Angeles by the Rockefeller Foundation is their failure to make any mention of it in their 1934 annual report. I think the Rockefeller Foundation is often behind cloaking activities. It seems that an effort to observe a polio outbreak unfolding would have been one of the premier public health projects of the year and heralded to donors in the public relations material, yet there is no mention of it in the 1934 annual report. The Rockefeller Foundation was only too happy to report its success against yellow fever, however. Before the partial perfection of a vaccination method first applied to human beings on May 13, 1931, one of the tragedies of yellow fever work was the comparatively great danger to laboratory workers and men engaged directly in the fight against yellow fever. Fortunately, this danger seems to have been ended by the timely application of a method of vaccination which consists in administering modified virus accompanied by immune serum. I read that one already. Likewise, the Rockefeller Foundation had no difficulty trumpeting their support of Kanner, who 9 years later would publish the first description of autism, as he attempted to develop a program for research and training at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. The departments of psychiatry and pediatrics of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine are cooperating in the development of a program of research and teaching in child psychiatry in the pediatric clinic under the direction of Dr. Leo Kanner, a former Rockefeller Foundation fellow. The annual reports of the Rockefeller Foundation also offered a window into the financial state of the foundation. Upon closer inspection, something curious appears along with this conspicuous omission: the disappearance of more than $7 million. I wonder who that was paid to. That little payoff. The Rockefeller Foundation entered the year 1935 with a little more than 153,600,000 in their principal fund. In 1935, that's a big chunk of change. In today's money, that is roughly equivalent to $2.5 billion. 153. Oh, maybe 100. I don't. Oh, today, that's what that would be. Yeah. At the end of 1935, they had realized a $50,000 increase in the principal fund for a little more than 153,650,000 in that fund. For a foundation with more than $150 million in principal, this principal increase was an expected amount. The principal throws off enough money to fund annual projects and research, and if there's a small yearly loss or gain, it doesn't make much of a difference to the ongoing work of the foundation. But starting in 1936, a different pattern shows up. From the years 1936 through 1939, the trustees of the foundation invade principal and transfer 7,800,000 to the appropriations account, resulting in a decrease in the value of the principal fund to a little over 146 million. Where did this substantial amount of money go? Could it have gone to the 198 nurses and doctors of the Los Angeles County General Hospital with the mystery affliction, aka ME chronic fatigue syndrome? Besides the more than $6 million cited by Hyde going to the patients, there would also have been administrative and legal fees. The numbers are suggestive, but in no way conclusive. I'm sure a few of those legal people were related to the Rockefellers, too. That might come up in the next chapter. Entertainment purposes only? They deserve a deeper explanation. Between 1940 and 1941, the trustees withdrew an additional 1,750,000, but this was balanced by the return of 1,700,000 in 1941 and 1942 from a canceled contingent project. When the account was reconciled from the years 1940 to 1945, there was a total loss to the fund of just 50,000. The 50,000 figure is a far cry from the 7,800,000 withdrawn from principal between 1936 and 1939. Why was there no mention of Rockefeller Foundation's investigation into the 1934 Los Angeles epidemic, where, in addition to polio, they observed the first chronic fatigue syndrome epidemic? The team from the Rockefeller Institute were welcomed as heroes by the citizens of Los Angeles. Why then do the exploits of the small, wiry Yale Professor Paul and the tall, handsome Webster disappear from the historical records of their own institution? That is intriguing. Paul and Webster have, in essence, become the invisible men of science. They were cloaked. Nearly 80 years have passed since those events of the 1930s. It may be impossible to recreate the precise chain of events that led to the creation of the Los Angeles General Hospital ME chronic fatigue syndrome outbreak and those first cases of autism. But that doesn't mean that we might not be able to make some educated guesses. I do a lot of that, Judy. In January of 2011, an article was published in the journal Frontiers in Microbiology that tried to make sense of the evolution of this type of retrovirus and the possible connection to human disease. The article was entitled Of Mice and Men. Oh, popular title. On the origin of the XMRV, the authors considered two possible scenarios. First, that the virus could have spread through direct virus transmission from mouse to human, and second, that it may have come from mouse biological products, specifically vaccines. One of the most widely distributed biological products was that freak widely distributed biological products that frequently involve mice or mouse tissue, at least up to recent years, are vaccines, and especially vaccines against viruses. It is possible that XMRV particles were present in virus stocks cultured in mice or mouse cells for vaccine production, and that the virus was transferred to the human population by vaccination. What if, like a character in some Greek tragedy who seeks to bring about something good for humanity, the scientists who sought to end terrible diseases like polio and yellow fever inadvertently created other diseases? Could the Brody vaccine have contained unsuspected new viruses caused by the mixing of animal and human tissue? Gee, if you look into the research at the Wuhan lab in China today, this sounds like that's some of the stuff they were doing over there. Hmm. Hmm. They learn and they learn. They learn good things and bad things. Unsuspected new viruses caused by the mixing of animal and human tissue. Could other researchers who mixed human and mouse tissue and cultures for vaccine and other biological products have created other entirely new strains of viruses? What if, in an attempt to solve the riddles of one plague, the scientists had created two more? And that is the end of chapter 5. It was a long one. I'm sorry, it took quite a while to read, but I hope you enjoyed my reading, and I'll get back to you with chapter 6 when I have time, because nowadays people are doing a lot of preserving for some reason and storing. I am among those. Okay, I hope you had fun. Oh gosh, here we go. Jeff is going to put some comments. Standard Oil Rockefeller could ground the Luftwaffe Sani Air Force at any time by stopping the supply of high altitude fuel additive. Yeah. Oh my goodness, from Poland. Thank you, Mary. Hugs from Poland. I have some Polish heritage. My grandma Blaczynski. Yes. I hear we might even have royal Polish blood. I do like glamkis and pierogis. And Jeff, Malgorzata is Skibinska, is from Poland. I hope I said your name correct, Malgorzata. And Jeff, according to official statistics from the government of Quebec in 2020, no one died due to accident, suicide, homicide, congenital malformations, and chromosomal abnormalities, perinatal conditions. Oh my goodness. Wasn't that amazing? I know. And everybody who had a motorcycle accident seemed to have died from something else that came from China. And Mal Gorzada Skabinska. Oh, that's amazing, she says, because I guess we both have some Polish in us. I'm such a true USA American. I am a Heinz 57. When they looked at my sister's DNA, because they were doing something to study her daughter who has spina bifida, we found out that, I'm Thompson now. So I used to say I'm Norwegian by marriage. Uh-uh. I have some Norwegian in me, some British. I have a good amount of Irish in me. That's probably why I'm entertaining. Malgorzata is Margaret in Polish. Oh, yes. And Jeff says, I love your voice, Mary, and I love your soul too. And I love all of you because you are monitoring in on my books, and I hope to read more. I have one up there that's I plan on doing, and it's the Confessions of a Male Certified Nursing Assistant on his way to the dementia ward. And I have just gotten a few chapters in, and it's, oh my goodness, it's such a delightful book, because we need to mix delightful books with these serious books. The gut's feeling, the best advice. I know, Jeff. I've studied a lot about this stuff. Part of why I wasn't reading books, I studied a lot. And I've studied a lot into the naturopathics that we can take that mimic, like HCQ and quercetin and ivermectin. And if you want to know some of the natural things you can eat in nature that will boost your immune system, because some of these things will make the absorption of vitamins and zinc into your cells intracellularly much more advanced. And anytime that immune system is strong, nothing can survive it. Our immune system is such a miraculous creation. So foods you guys might want to really eat are apple, include the peels. So watch all that pesticide off the outside of the peels and eat the peels. And the white of citrus peels, that's yeah. That's a good one. And apple cider vinegar is very, very good, but it has to have the mother in it. It has to be the fermenting vinegar that's still alive, like the kind of vinegar I use in my kombucha tea. Kombucha tea is also very, very good for you, high in the vitamin B12. It actually takes the sugar in your gut and changes it into vitamin B12 and glutathione, which is a number one detoxing and liver regenerating um, um, thing that you can buy as a supplement, but your body also makes it, especially if you're drinking kombucha tea. So I make my own kombucha tea. If you guys can find out how to make it, I don't know if they're doing that in Poland or where Jeff is from. I presume Jeff is from the North America region here. And there's one more. Oh, papaya and papaya seeds. Extremely good against worms, any kind of worm infection, parasite infections, and known to prevent some cancers. And lo and behold, this one that comes over from China is also affected by the papaya. And what we do is we take the seeds out and dry them. It takes about a week. They look like fish eggs. You put a paper towel, and then you put paper, and then you put the seeds on top of that. Then you take another plate with the paper towel, and you just flip flop them back and forth, every day for about a week, and then they're finally dried. And for prevention, we take 3 to 5 papaya seeds today, and we've heard it's safe to take an entire teaspoon of papaya, and it is supposed to mimic ivermectin. Ah, Jeff says he drinks kombucha every day, an apple or a day, or banana. I don't have any medicine at home. You're eating superfoods there, Jeff. That's beautiful, Quebec. You're from Quebec. Oh, my heart has been crying for you people up there. Um, I cry and pray for you daily. Okay? Us Americans have to stick together because we're all Americans. We're all from North America. And we're just called United States of America, and Canada's Canadian Americans. So let's hope we can keep our cities beautiful, Jeff. Let's pray for that. Okay, I think I'm going to sign off now. It's getting time for me to eat something for dinner, and I can hear my husband getting restless upstairs. So tune in tomorrow if I come, or tune in next time. You better hit subscribe and what, I don't know, that bell, I think. I'm not used to I'm not used to promoting myself. Okay. Bye bye. I'm going to end the stream now. I love you guys. God bless.